To set the intention right, the intention for today's session is to at present when at present, where across the world, social and emotional learning, SEL is gaining increasing attention within the education system. Yet, as ideas, frameworks, and evaluation approaches travel across contexts, quite but yet a basic question emerge around, which is like whose knowledge counts, what becomes visible, what remains invisible, and how power shapes these processes. So today we hope to explore these questions through perspectives from global south, to be more specific, South Asian countries, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And of course, since we are hosting it, India is also we are gonna share from our perspectives on whose knowledge counts and how what happens when SEL travels around the world. So before we start, there is few housekeeping notes that I would like to share. This session is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube. So if anyone has any concerns regarding recording, please reach out to my colleague Chandra. You can find him in the chat, in the participant list. His name is Chandra. So you can reach out to him. Nonetheless, the live streaming is anyway happening. Please keep your microphones muted unless it's the question and answers time that when we are discussing. So until then, I would request all of you to keep your microphones off. However, you can use the chat box anytime to share your reflection, questions, or anything that emerges for you. And we will have a dedicated question and answer segment towards the end of the session after the panel. So if you would like to ask anything directly to the panelists, feel free to make use of the question and answer section. So you can directly ask that. Otherwise, always feel free to add anything in the chat box. We have also have international sign language interpreters, Saurav Roy Chaudhary and Rajesh Manohar with us, who will be supporting the language accessibility throughout the session. Yeah, these are a few announcements that I have. Yeah. I'll briefly walk you all through the session design that we have today. We'll begin with a short reflection activity that I would request all the participants to engage with. And then we have an opening remarks session by Dr. Srihari, followed by the panel discussion. And post that, there will be a question and answer section where you can also ask the question as I mentioned in the housekeeping rules. Post that, there is another collective reflective activity that also is some questions that I would like you guys to answer, you people to answer. Post that synthesis, closing, key insight, sharing part. So this will be the outline, major outline of the session, and this will be the day, the session moving. Yes. So as I mentioned, we would like to start with a moment of reflection, a small check-in question, as I said. So the question goes like, according to you, what is one aspect of evaluation most visible in education today? So this is a moment for reflection. We don't want to analyze, we don't want to do anything with the answer right now. It is just for us to just bring people check into this session and also to know what you are thinking, where you are coming from. My colleagues have posted the question Mentimeter link in the chat box, so you can use the link in the chat box to answer what is coming for you. There is no right and wrong answer. Nothing we are expecting out of this particular answer. There's no agenda behind this question. So you can share whatever which is coming to you. Question is, according to you, what is one aspect of evaluation most visible in education today? I can see percentages, competition, child development outcomes coming in. Let the answers come. child development again, low reading levels, reading and comprehension. Yeah. Grades, of course. FLN. Yeah. Reading, literacy, numeracy. Yeah. Yeah. I'm already noticing a lot of words or answers around assessments, grades, outcomes related to FLN and child development, a lot of things. Let the answers come in. As you are answering this, we can go a little bit deeper to socio-emotional learning, which and where the conversation we are today living. So the next question for you to reflect and answer is, what is one thing around socio-emotional learning that matters in your context, your particular context? That can be anything that you think your context is, but often remains invisible, undervalued, or difficult to capture. Same goes here. The link is in chat. You can answer based on whatever which is coming for you, whatever matters in your context, but often remains invisible, undervalued, or perhaps difficult to capture. Let's have the answers come in. We can have the word cloud as well displaying here. Yeah. The large one is street smartness, which is like on face now. Self-regulation. Safe space. Psychology of the child. Care. Language used with child. Yes. Empathy. Resilience. There's quite a lot of basic yet the innate essence of humane thing which is coming right now. Like a lot of like soft skills that we usually mention as like resilience, empathy, psychology of the child coming in. Yeah. Thank you everyone for participating in this activity. As I said, I'm not gonna like anything which is coming is valid here and counts in this discussion. So thank you for all of you who have shared, and this also sets the pace for the session and also bridge the reflection activity to the opening remarks that Dr. Srihari is gonna give. So I'm inviting Dr. Srihari to offer some opening reflection. A little bit about Srihari. Srihari is a director of research and impact of Dream and Train India, whose work focuses on social and emotional learning, well-being centered pedagogies, and creating conditions for children and young people to thrive, particularly in context of adversity. Over the past 15 years, he has worked across education systems in Global South, leading initiatives on SEL, teacher mindsets, and evidence-informed policy reform. Dr. Srihari's work and like words has consistently encouraged us, especially coming from his team, to think critically about learning, knowledge production, evaluation, and context. His reflection always help us to frame the conversation around SEL evaluation in a larger sense. So I hope, yes, reflection today will also like today will help us everyone to frame our conversation around SEL evaluation and perspectives emerging from Global South. Over to you, Srihari.
Thank you, Naka, for the kind words. And also, it's good to know the activity that we have done is something that I'm also really reflecting on when we have to talk about or set this context of this whole panel. With that, let me start. Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome on behalf of Dream a Dream. It is when I was just looking at the list of people who have joined. It's wonderful to see colleagues and friends joining us from different part of the world. I am particularly delighted that our panelists are joining us from Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal. There is something quite special that brings together neighbors of the South Asia to this conversation. While we come from different contexts, histories, and educational systems, many of the questions that we are actually thinking around when we talk about social-emotional learning, like around well-being, belonging, learning, and flourishing, they are all very similar. In that sense, I'm not really finding this as a very formal panel discussion, more, or rather, it's like more like a conversation among neighbors reflecting on the challenges and possibilities that we can collectively discuss. And thank you for being here, and thank you for helping us to create this space for dialogue, reflection, and learning. Just to set the context, the whole panel is around is what probably I just want to share some of my thoughts around it. The very theme of this panel is around, it's about movement, translations, exchanges, and what happens when educational ideas when ideas actually cross borders and enter new context. For those who have spent time in the education, I think almost all of us who are here actually spend our time in the field of education, knows that education ideas have always traveled across histories, ideas about teaching, learning, assessment, any reform that we talk about, all those things are actually moved across countries, culture, and systems. At the same time, we also know that educational ideas never actually traveled unchanged. They were translated, they were adapted, resisted, interpreted in the context that we have, and sometimes it's also transformed entirely by the context the whole process of encountered. I think for me, socio-emotional learning is perhaps one of the most fascinating examples in this process. Over the last 2 decades, so where we have coiled this term life skills and socio-emotional learning, it traveled from research centers, universities, philanthropic organizations, and international agencies into our classrooms, into our teacher education programs, into the government policies and educational systems around the world. Yet, as SEL has traveled, something important also happened. It became more than a pedagogical framework. What we now realize is that the SEL that we talk about is increasingly become something that the system seeks to define, evaluate, compare, measure, and govern. And that's probably the most important context I would like to offer here. I always question this, the two questions, or one question that I sit with is I no longer think the important question about SEL is whether SEL works. We have enough evidences providing this or proving this one. The most interesting question is what happens when SEL becomes governable, which means if I unpack that one, it means what happens when it enters policy frameworks, what happens when it becomes measurable, what happens when it becomes comparable, when it becomes data, and perhaps most importantly, what happens when it is actually traveling. Because when educational ideas becomes governable, they often begin to change. Some of our conversations, what we begin as conversation about relationship can become a conversation about indicators. What begins as a conversation about flourishing, which is a buzzword now, we call flourishing, thriving, well-being, can become conversation about measurement. How can we actually measure it? What begins as a conversation about human experiences can become conversation about data. This is not necessarily a criticism. I'm not trying to say evaluation is a bad activity to actually do. Education system needs evaluations. Policymakers need informations. Evaluations play a very critical role in the whole space. It's something sometimes, but I actually wonder whether we underestimate the power of evaluation itself, what I call it as the politics of the whole evaluation and measurement. We often assume that evaluation simply help us to understand reality, yet evaluation does much more than that. Evaluation shapes the attention, it shapes priorities, it shapes legitimacy, and what becomes measured becomes visible. What becomes visible becomes important. What becomes important attracts resources, policy attention, and funding. Over time, systems begins to organize themselves around what they can actually see. One of the biggest insights this whole SEL space that, especially in the global south or global majority sits with is that we often now say that what we measure is not necessarily what matters, but what we measure often becomes what matters. Let me repeat. What we measure is not necessarily what matters, but what we measure often becomes what matters. For me, this is one of the central tension in the conversation of SEL. The question is not whether SEL needs to be evaluated. The question is what form of social emotional learning become visible through evaluations and what form of evaluation that becomes invisible. What form of well-being is recognized, what form of belonging becomes valued, what form of thriving becomes legitimate, and perhaps equally important, what forms disappears from views because if they do not fit neatly into a system of evidence, system of evaluation, into an MEL framework, or into a robust evidence processes that we do. The question becomes more even important when educational ideas travel context. One of the assumptions that often underpins global educational discourse is that concepts such as well-being, the terminologies, right? Well-being, agency, resilience, emotional regulation, these are all the common terms we use in the social-emotional spaces. They have universal meaning. And the more we work across context, the global south or the global majority, we are less convinced with the fact that it becomes concept. They are not, these concepts are culturally neutral. Across many parts of South Asia, as we have panelists from South Asia, well-being is often experienced through relationship rather than individual achievement. The whole idea of agency is frequently exercised through community rather than separated from community. The word like flourishing or thriving is often imagined as something collectively rather than something very from a Western perspective as a psychological trait. These differences matters because when SEL travel, it does not arrive in an empty space, in encounter existing tradition of care, responsibility, and community and belonging. Translations, one of our theme around these panel discussions around translation. It's not about it's not only linguistic exercise alone. It becomes an exercise of power. Who gets to define well-being? What gets to be defined as agency? What understanding of flourishing becomes authoritative and whose understanding remains invisible? For me personally, this is where the Global South enters this conversation in a particularly very important manner. Global South is positioned as always in the global discourse as ideas to be implemented, adapted, or tested. Yet I believe this framing fundamentally underestimate what these contexts contribute to education thoughts. Global South is not simply offering adaptation, it is offering alternatives, ways of imagining human flourishing. Across our communities in the global majority, culture, and the education systems, there are long tradition of nurturing empathy, responsibility, care, belonging, and collective well-being. Long before the language of SEL emerged, children were learning these things through relationship, through community participation, through family structures, and through everyday life. So the issue is not that Global South lack SEL or socio-emotional skills. The issue is that many of these practices remain invisible within dominant education systems of evaluations and invisible when it becomes part of evaluation and knowledge productions. Perhaps, I will probably call it as a paradox. The challenge before us is not simply how Global South can learn from socio-emotional skills. Perhaps the challenge is whether socio-emotional skills improve, movement is prepared to learn from the Global South. The future challenge in SEL is therefore not merely about the point I'm trying to make is that the SEL is not merely about measuring competencies more effectively. Perhaps the challenge is developing richer ways of recognizing the relational foundations upon which learning itself happens. what are the conditions that enable children to learn and thrive is what we are actually looking for. As I conclude, I would like to return to the question to the central question of this panel. The significance of SEL lies not simply in the competencies it identifies or the indicators it produces, but in what it reveals about education itself. From a global South perspective, this conversation is also about whose knowledge counts and what alternative understanding of thriving educational system might learn from. Ultimately, this conversation extends beyond question of framework, competencies, or measurement. It asks us to reflect on how educational system decides what becomes visible, at the same time what remains as invisible, whose understanding of well-being, belonging, and thriving are recognized. And in many ways, the future of SEL may depend not only on how effectively we are able to evaluate it, but on how thoughtfully we engage with these questions of knowledge, power, and flourishing. I'm pretty sure the panelists will be able to unpack it more with their experience and the diverse contexts that we work with. I believe this will be a useful panel for everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Srihari. Thank you for your thoughtful reflection as usual. What becomes visible is what is important, and whose knowledge becomes the 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 framework for what becomes visible. Like all these things is the thing that is echoing here is exactly as you're saying, the evaluation is never neutral, it is political. And here it is for us that it's global south coming together and seeing alternatives from our context and adapting the global north frameworks, definitions, or taxonomies that defines the social emotional learning and skills. With that framing, let us move into today's panel discussion. I am starting this with introducing our distinguished panel members. Today, we have Dr. Bhavana Shrestha from Nepal. Dr. Bhavana is an educator, researcher, and SEL practitioner, currently serving as a research fellow at Xianzhou Tong Liverpool University and co-founder of My Emotion Matter, based out of Nepal. Her work focused on emotionally inclusive, compassionate, and equity-centered education, and spans research, teacher development programs, emotional literacy, and well-being initiatives across multiple contexts. Welcome, Bhavana.
Thank you.
Next, yeah. Next, we have Mr. Manjula Disnaike. Manjula is joining from Sri Lanka. Manjula is a founder and executive director of Educate Lanka Foundation and also serves as a member of Executive Committee of Karanga, the Global Alliance for SEL and Life Skills. His works focus on ensuring that all young people have access to opportunities to learn, lead, and thrive. And he continues to champion inclusion and educational equity globally. Welcome, Manjula. Our third panelist, Ms. Sara Khan from Pakistan. Sara is a doctoral researcher in psychology at the University of Karachi and the founder of Sara Khan Associates. Her work sits at the intersection of behavioral science, social emotional learning, and system change. She currently leads efforts to contextualize global SEL frameworks for South Asian context, especially in the Pakistan context, through her partnership with Harvard University's ESEL Lab. Welcome, Sara.
Thank you, Anaga.
Last but not the least, we have Dr. Tabassum Amna, joining from Bangladesh. Tabassum is Associate Professor and Head of Academics at BRAC Institute of Educational Development, BRAC University, Bangladesh. She also leads initiatives focused on mental health and psychosocial well-being, working to integrate SEL and mental health awareness across educational and community setting. Welcome, Dr. Tabassum.
Thank you, Anaga. Happy to be here.
I know that the bio that I have given is like very short of like what you are doing. So like a broad one is there in the chat box, and you can like always like look upon these people that are panelists in the Google also. Like they have done amazing works in the SEL and education landscape. And so thank you. First of all, thank you for being here and agreeing to participate in a panel discussion for this enriching conversation. Whatever we have, I had the opportunity to talk, been a very enriching, enriching experience for me. So I hope this panel also will be the same for everyone who have joined today. So coming from educational system in Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh, each of you bring rich context and cultural perspectives on social emotional learning, as we were talking. From your work, from your experience in living in this places. So my first question to everyone is that how is social and emotional learning understood and practiced in your context? It can be both formal and informal ways. And which aspects of this work get lost when we see them within the universal definitions of framework? I'll repeat the question. How SEL understood and practiced in your context, formally and informally, and which aspects of this work get lost when we see them within the universal definitions of framework? We can take the answer in the order of Bhavana, Sara, Manjula, and Tapasu.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anaga, and thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me and being a part of this discussion. It's a pleasure to be here. To answer your question, I think I want to give the context of Nepal. So in Nepal, social emotional learning is often practiced. I think it's practiced long before it was even named social emotional learning, because while this formal social emotional learning frameworks are relatively very recent, not much studies have been done, like many schools and teachers and even families and communities have already already been engaging in practices that really support empathy as a culture, emotional regulation, and we are very collective as a society. So collective responsibility is already there. The feeling of care, belonging, and nurturing is there. So I think it has been practiced like long before social emotional learning as a framework was introduced. I want to give an example. Like, for example, many teachers spend significant time listening to students, their personal stories, struggles. They also mediate conflicts and support students facing family challenges, and these actions are rarely documented as SEL, yet they are often the foundation upon which learning becomes possible in the context like Nepal, which in as a country has gone through several crises. So this part of it becomes very important. And similarly, a lot of community practices of collective caregiving, like interdependence, storytelling, and learning through relationships play a very important role in children's social emotional development, which is also a practice in the context of Nepal. And what often gets lost when it comes to universal frameworks is that this relational and contextual dynamics is something I often find it missing. When SEL is reduced to like set of competencies or indicators, I think we risk overlooking the everyday acts of care, everyday acts of trust building, and also we somehow kind of discount the emotional labor that makes these competences possible. So for me, the challenge is not about the global frameworks. I'm not definitely against it. It's not inherently problematic, but I think I often struggle to recognize the forms of SEL that emerge from these local cultures, relationships, history, and yeah, there's so much more within our own culture. Yeah, thank you.
So I'm just going to continue and I absolutely echo the sentiments and the opinion of Dr. Bhavna and Dr. Sri. This is what I have to share as well. So SEL has existed in Pakistan for decades. In the region, it has existed for centuries. It just hasn't been called SEL. It's called maybe moral education, civic education, values education. And if you're talking formally within Pakistan as part of the national curriculum, no, not yet. It's not yet recognized as part of the national education framework. However, there are works underway. So that leaves schools either high-end private schools or the trust-based schools to adopt SEL however they can, and within their schools. And within that, we see that the understanding of SEL begins and ends with the word Kasi, unfortunately. So what's happening here in absence of concrete guidelines on the national level. So people, policymakers, researchers, and practitioners are trying to adopt the frameworks and practices developed in the global north and trying to implement them here. And the problem with that is the frameworks that are designed mostly in the global north, they have a very different way of conceptualizing these social and emotional skills. And that is a very federal, categorical way of looking at these skills, where each skill is very distinctly placed in very neat categories. And that is far from the case when it comes to the global south, where it's maybe high conflict, low resource, and highly culturally diverse. So when you try to fit the realities of the global south into a mold that was developed in the global north for the global north audience, so the impact is not obviously not as effective. So yes, there are people who are trying to design and deliver these programs, but the result is not there. So what gets lost is, even within, based on the almost 8 to 9 years of practice and research that we have been doing here in Pakistan, even within the social and emotional, there was a time when we were talking about how technical skills and then there are non-technical skills, right? There was this distinction, and we have all understood that distinction so far. But even within these soft skills and these social emotional skills, they cannot be treated equally. And they cannot be given the same level of weightage or importance when it comes to designing uh, programs around it and ultimately designing the assessments around it. So there comes a science which is not yet catered to in the frameworks that are developed in the global north, and not many of us are paying attention to that. So the foundational layer, that is the layer which Bhavna and Dr. Sri has already identified. It's more relational, it's more identity based, it's more philosophy based. It's not yet captured. If it's not captured, it's not considered important, and it's not even talked about. And yeah, so that it's an entire mess, and I really hope to explore this further with what my fellow panelists share further. Thank you so much.
That's me, Anaga, right?
Yes.
Hi, thanks. Hi everyone. I'm Manjul Disanaik, founder of Educate Lanka Foundation, a social enterprise nonprofit organization that's based out of US as well as in Sri Lanka. I grew up my entire first 19 years of my life in Sri Lanka, and then I moved to the United States, and my career took a turn after starting in investment banking into founding the organization and committing my kind of the secondary part of my career into building the organization in Sri Lanka. So I've kind of lived both kind of in the global south and spent half of my life here in the global north, which gives a unique perspective. At the same time, we have a very dedicated team in Sri Lanka that is leading our operations and programs on the ground, really built from community up model in serving our students. So when presented with this question, I think both Bhavana and Sarah alluded to the fact that SEL has been long been in practice in our context and our countries. And I think the case is similar for Sri Lanka as well. Given kind of as South Asian countries, we know we are collective societies and a very rich and complicated histories. We often have this rich community, family traditions and practices, and SEL is often lived through these lived experiences of every individual. But when it comes to formal education, that's where you see the gap. As we've always, as we've all been colonized and been kind of exposed to those integrations, our education systems and formal systems are often designed not from sort of a ground up way, but some systems that we've adopted over time. So that might not reflect the actual learning or the learning that we as a society is needs in our context for our young people. I would echo what both of them said before, in the sense that in our formal systems, we miss this SEL in our formal curriculums and our measurements and what we value, what education and learning means in our society. But it is often lived through family experiences, relationships, faith, community relationships, and these often go missing or not recognized, unrecognized when it comes to what we value and mean and recognize as what education means for a young person in our context. I'll give you an example in our work. For example, we serve with uh, socioeconomically marginalized students all across the country. And when you take one of these young students, on average, they come from a poverty background, and they come with immense challenges, but they build this resilience. Oftentimes, if you take a student, they're on the verge of dropping out when they come to our programs. They often sacrifice their own education journey to provide their siblings with an opportunity to gain that level of education. So through these experiences and these challenges, one develops resilience, self-awareness, confidence, and when they go into the society and employment, often these become very highly sought after skills. But if you take a look at their transcripts and report cards, O-level exams and A-level exams, none of these get recognized or acknowledged in those formal measurement outcomes. So there's this huge mismatch in what we consider or value as education in a society and what education ought to be in the 21st century, especially with the kind of the technological transformation that we are seeing across the world. I think we are falling more and more behind in adapting our education systems to really take a holistic viewpoint of what education means and what we value education as, and then how we measure that education to reflect what we need to see in a young person, not just preparing them for employment and kind of economic mobility, but to really prepare them for life, to face those challenges, uncertainty, and to thrive in their journey beyond that employment and academic achievements. And I'm sure we'll be getting into kind of more details about questions around measurements later, but I would leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's my cue. Thank you, Anaga, and thank you for having me here. And it's really wonderful to be part of the discussion where we talk about SEL in South Asia. I'm Tabassum, I'm from Bangladesh, currently teaching at BRAC Institute of Education Development and BRAC University. So when you look at, social emotional learning in our context, what we see is like it's, very similar to what my previous speakers have said, is it's very embedded in our everyday relationships and experiences, right? Rather than being treated in a silo as a separate concept that we see often happens in the global north. We see that SEL is reflected in our initiatives, for example, as at our institute, where we focus on like play, communication building, life skills program for adolescents, initiatives that we have to prevent early marriage among young children through building their decision-making skills and things like that. So informally, SEL happens through families and extended canes. In the communities, it happens through childcare spaces or early childhood development programs, community-based systems, and things like that. At our institute, we do what we have this model called the BRAC Paracounselor model, where we develop community-based paracounselors in the community who provide door-to-door services. And they work to improve the well-being of children and caregivers by increasing SEL knowledge in the mothers, right? By emphasizing on the importance of play and communication, active listening. So here it's not in the words SEL, but the knowledge that is spread, that is done, it is actually a form of SEL that we see to practice. Also, in our context, we don't see SEL to be just in the classrooms. We see that it's integrated into adult informal learning. We see it integrated in building resilience in climate crisis areas, even in culturally grounding activities and actions that we carry out in humanitarian contexts. So many of these practices, support social emotional learning and in our context, and it's not formally labeled as SEL. So in that way, we have, for example, what we call the childcare and community-based programs where we really focus on building strong relationships between caregivers, parents, and children in kind of a triangle of care. And this build of trust and relationship is really for emotional support. And in that way, when these caregivers are also been working in daycare settings, they work to demonstrate warmth, emotional attunement that helps children develop confidence, empathy, and a sense of security. So in these practices, what we do see is that SEL is practiced in the form of caregiving, sometimes what we define as like discipline, or just caregiving, but it is actually a process of building social emotional learning. If we look at our practices of SEL and its alignment to the Global North practices, one of the distinct differences or gap that we will see is in their frameworks is their lack of importance or their lack of existence of the importance on collectivity and cultural grounding of practices in SEL. So many SEL approaches emphasize in the Global North focusing on individual skills, looking at personal achievement, self-awareness, and building on those things. But when we look at Bangladesh, and as my other fellow colleagues have said about South Asian countries, we really see a very strong connection to family relationships, social responsibilities, and building on community and harmony in the community. So in these cases, what we see is success often is not just individual success for us, rather a success is when it's for community and more extended beyond ourselves. And that is really where we see that in the SEL frameworks of the Global North does not really include this kind of perspective in the vision of SEL that they're sharing, and that's really most popular or accepted. Yes, I think I'll stop there for now. So that's sort of giving a little bit of idea on what SEL looks like in our context and the things that we do.
Thank you, everyone. Very similar perspective from different contexts. I'm hearing a lot around how SEL's been from very beginning, even though it's not termed as SEL or included in the formal system, how care, trust, and the everyday aspects been there in our community and from in our family relationship from very beginning, but not formally been like discussed or like documented per se, but like we were having the benefits of that. And also like how the global north frameworks definitions sometimes makes or mostly makes it stops at the classroom level and not translating that to life and realities of young people perhaps. Yes, that actually leads to my second question. So second question is would like to take in parts. So first part of the question is in what ways do prevailing evaluation frameworks shape what count as valid evidence of social emotional learning? Probably another way of thinking that this question can be what realities, histories, or assumptions shape these understandings of evidence or what count as valid evidence. I would like to direct this question to Dr. Tabassum and Sarah.
Okay, so if we look at historically in South Asian societies, we often tend to connect with education, learning, and an education institutional environment where which is to obedience or conformity and appropriate behaviors. At the same time, we really strongly focus on academic success, where it's where SEL has for the longest time has not been integrated, has been a part of the learning process in learning institutions. So and in that process also what we see is the skills that SEL really focuses on. It has really received very limited recognition in the broader aspects of well-being. Where SEL, even though it does emphasize or affect the decision-making agencies, builds confidence and things like that, but our general context has not really been focused on that. So as a result, what we've seen is, when we're evaluating SEL in education, a lot of this assessment that we see around SEL is really on looking at numeracy and literacy rates and effect on that. Also with that, what we see is how successful an SEL integration is often seen through, like the set indicators and meeting the marks and those numbers become really important. However, what we have seen is if you're really looking at assessments, and if you really wanted to understand SEL, as we integrate SEL into learning, formal and informal learning environments, what we really see is it's really a very narrow way of looking at SEL. And if you really want to see assessment and understand how SEL is really affecting human development, it's really important to see SEL from a larger context. So what we do is we have found that, to understand social emotional development, it is often required to get a more human-centered approach, right? So we really focus on storytelling. We look at continuous observation, creating spaces to express ideas and thoughts and views, integrating play for younger kids, and so that their emotional development happens through play, through use of different kinds of tools to express what they're thinking. So in that way, what we see is it's not only looking at numbers to see, yes, is it still working or not, but really understanding the collective lived experiences of children that goes beyond what is happening just in the classroom and specific test scores. Also, what we see is SEL is one of those things that you cannot really see to show results very quickly, right? It takes time to see the impact of SEL. So it's really important to invest in SEL for a significant period of time, actually, to be able to see the evidence that SEL really has. And coming from a developing country, that's one of the things that we often find challenges is finding investment in the area of like SEL. So it really needs to be important that we do assess what SEL is doing, but we also look into prolonged investment in the SEL, and at the same time understand that SEL assessments has to go beyond the classroom, beyond statistical data, and look into that child or even that person's life in a longer term, looking at how their relationships have evolved, looking at how they persevere, looking at how they, how their decision makings happen in different aspects of life beyond the classroom itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just going to add to that I have a more zoomed out perspective to this entire dilemma here, because the evaluation frameworks that we're talking about, once again, are the ones that are developed mostly in the global north. So they kind of favor the audience that they were developed for. And if they are used as they are in our context, they kind of miss the most essential part of our, when we talk about social and emotional skill conceptualization. So the fix, I believe, in my perspective, in my experience, it starts with the theory, getting the theory right first, because the theory ends up governing all sorts of practices and measures that come into picture later on. And right now, we do not have some guiding framework or principle that gauges the true nature of social and emotional learning and development across both children and adults in the global south. So instead of just merely focusing on adapting these frameworks and theories, how about just focusing on producing that maybe from the grounded theory approach? And a little bit of perspective, specifically within Pakistan, when it comes to social emotional skills evaluation, there have been two large scale social emotional skills survey that OECD has done. I know India was part of the last second cycle that was done. In both of these cycles, Pakistan did not participate. So we don't even have that data to have some sort of standards or benchmarks to begin with. So even on the international and global level, Pakistan data is not there, it's not represented. Both internationally and nationally, we do not have any benchmark. So, and there is this this phrase that goes around a lot, that what gets assessed gets addressed. So if you're not even evaluating something, measuring something, how are you gonna develop interventions and programs to flourish it further? So right now, the data does not even exist for students, for adults, and this is what we're precisely trying to solve with our work in Pakistan. But then again, like I said, it's not that simple. It's not like you can just take whatever the tools and surveys or self-report instruments or behavior measures, performance measures that are there and use it in our work. We can't do that, like I said, because they are based on a theory that's not mimicking the kind of experiences and the realities we have here. And it misses, and it kind of treats all these social emotional skills in very similar fashion, right? And what we have found that cognitive skills maybe are not same as the value-based skills or the perspective-based skill or the identity skill. So you have got to have a very different approach to assessing that, to developing that. But yeah, once again, the theory does not exist. And this is what our part is from the global south. It's maybe to contribute that theory forward, test it within Pakistan. Yes, we have evidence coming in, not just from Pakistan, but we are working on a B2BC manner with schools in UAE, Malaysia, Vietnam. And we are starting to see that this theory does hold some merit, right? We cannot, there is the cultural and the cross-regional nuance to social and emotional learning that requires a different lens, a different way to be conceptualized. And once that's settled, so we have this foundation, and then we can start building on the data and the programs and all. So this fix starts with, I believe, instead of importing or adapting the Western framework, focusing on developing, originating the theories based on the lived experiences of the people from the global south.
Thank you both. And what I'm saying is, time and again, we are coming back to the same space of it's not a no to assessment, but how we do it. What how assessment looks in a global south country and how for a developing country it is. Like what are the culture, what are the context that is important. And also like as Sarah was saying, um, no to like how the theories should be emerging from the context rather than adapting a theory which is already there in global north, which we don't relate to. This actually leads to the next part of the question. So right now we are not in the phase of creating, we have not already created theory. So we are using a framework that actually won't fit our context. So when we are using this, when we are doing this, what and whom do these framework leave out? Whose knowledge, experience, or ways of learning are we overlooked, and what impact does that have? Working in the ground with teachers, young people, I would like to hear your perspective on this. Manjula and Bhavna.
Thank you. Yeah, so piggybacking on kind of recognizing why evaluation frameworks and measurement is important, it is, if we take kind of a step back and really think about what gets evaluated, uh, typically evaluation is dictated by what we consider as valuable. So as a system, as a society, what we value gets measured and evaluated. So if you really want SEL to be evaluated, the first step is recognizing that SEL is important and critical. SEL is important and critical as a centerpiece of education and learning, not as an afterthought or a nice to have add-on. That is what current status quo in a lot of our context gets practiced in the formal education system. So I think that's a policy level shift and a systemic change, systematic mindset shift, starting from parents to educators to policymakers and all the other stakeholders involved in our society needs to be made, because right now what we see is we consider these great. The emotional intelligence gets talked about often when we talk about AI and shifts in workforce trends and what is recognized and what is important for young people to learn. But we see this massive gap in what's being demanded or asked to be taught versus what we teach in our classrooms. So I think we are running out of time there to really make those shifts happen. And I think Global South, more importantly, because kind of how our education systems have been designed, really need to leapfrog in making those transformations and changes. If kind of going back to our own work through Educare Lanka, if you take a student that comes to our scholarship programs, if they come from the socioeconomic marginalized backgrounds, and when they are matched with an investor to or a sponsor to fund their educational journey through our micro scholarship program, what happens is not just them being able to attend those additional years of learning and education in the formal system, but it creates this massive spike in their confidence. Oftentimes, this is the first time that someone has believed and invested in them. So that becomes their huge motivation for them to do well in the classrooms, but not only that, but to pay it forward to others. One of the questions that we ask in our application is, how do you how will you use this scholarship and investment that we are making from secondary all the way through higher education to pay it forward, and what contributions will you make to the society? So that level of mindset shift, if we can track and measure, gets evaluated, is going to, if you ask an employer what would you see in a potential employee, I would bet that someone who's lived through those experiences and built that level of resilience and come through those hardships and being able to challenge and adapt to different circumstances and challenges in life, uh, on top of building those academic qualifications and extra level of years of education, versus someone just go through the system without not having to have those challenges as a young person, just gaining those academic qualifications and grades in your transcript. You know, as an employer, what you value most. But when it comes to our academic outcomes, none of those gets reported, evaluated, measured, and presented. So on one hand, we have these credentials that everyone loves to accumulate, right? The badges, the degrees, the diplomas, certificates. But then there's this complete other part of learning that goes missing, and often not talked about. In the global north here, you have those standardized exams, but at least in the college application essay, there's an essay that you can write where you basically capture all that learning in one essay, and it gets evaluated. But in a context like Sri Lanka, to get into university, the only thing matters is your Z-score, which gets calculated by your A-level results. So if you fail that, you have to repeat that exam over and over, and just for this memorization of content and knowledge, and get tested in a 2-hour exam. So we have narrowed and limited someone's entire life of learning into 2 hours of measurement, and ignore everything else that person has gone through. So I think the first part of this is that recognition SEL is critical and centered to every person's learning, and then design those frameworks to actually capture those transformations that the person goes through in their lives, and those mindset shifts, the behavioral changes, the application, the care that they have for the community and the family and the world at large. And that's the framework that we want to see happening. Thank you.
Okay, so let me carry that notion forward, because I absolutely agree with what Manjula shared. Along with what he shared, I just want to share that one of the other biggest concerns in terms of evaluation frameworks, privileging, is that it usually focuses on what is easily measurable over what is deeply meaningful. So what gets left out is often the voices of the teachers, students, families, and communities who experience SEL in everyday life. For example, teachers may spend years, just like Manjula mentioned, that years cultivating trust with the students, and yet that relational work rarely appears in any reports, in any indicators, or in any dashboard. So that is one of the biggest challenges. And in many global south contexts, and I can talk more about Nepal, that for example, teachers are already carrying significant emotional responsibilities, and when evaluation system focuses only on measurable outcomes, they can unintentionally make this labor very invisible, and because of which teachers may feel pressure to produce evidence of SEL, even without receiving adequate recognition or support for the relational work that actually sustains it. So the chances are high that they would not want to put an effort on what they had already been doing from very long. So that is one of the risks that I really see. And in terms of like students can also be affected with it, because if evaluation frameworks define success too narrowly, they may fail to capture diverse ways of expressing emotions, building relationships, or I would say even demonstrating the growth as well. So what we call growth, that in itself is a question. So if we can only say growth as the numbers, what we can quantify, then that is the biggest challenge that we are navigating at the current moment. So what counts as confidence, what counts as participation, or also like the emotional expression can vary significantly across culture and communities, can be a part of the evaluation process. It's a part of knowledge, it's a part of experience, and I think it's a part of the collective culture that we are growing through, which is often discounted when we only borrow these ideas from a global north, I would say, because these frameworks in itself, I think we have already like argued and kind of like established the notion that if we only keep on borrowing these notions without acknowledging the emotion, the cultural grounding that we have, just like Dr. Tabassum mentioned, it's really difficult to even nurture or even flourish that what we already have. So there's a chance of diminishing that as well. So question I think therefore is not simply that what we are measuring, but I guess it's about whose realities are shaping the measurement in the first place. And it's very important that we are trying to bring in these voices. And in a lot of like Nepali context, I also feel that because social emotional learning is very holistic, right? So when we are measuring, we kind of try to bring the learning impact, we try to bring students perspective, we are now gradually moving on to teachers experiences. But I think even with the global south perspective, what we're missing is in the emerging research as well as the family's perspective. How would the family environment or the culture shape social emotional learning? Like what is happening inside the family? Because even if we look at the frameworks that we are practicing, the frameworks now have now started talking about including community as well. So and somehow we are missing that significant portion of understanding community and the culture as we are measuring that. So I would really focus on more meaningful deep conversations and maybe data to something that is easily measurable or quantifiable. I would like to summarize this particular answer with this, Anaga.
Yeah, thank you. What's surfacing is that whose realities the assessments is shaped by. And as you mentioned that we are moving from the universal framework to voices of students, teachers, and families, as you mentioned, and these were the pillars which helped us to create or like made us thrive in our lives, but not often recognized in the system and in the numbers. So, and hence the burden falls on these people invisibly. So how these can be like reimagined, relooked through assessments is something that all of us are coming together for. The next question is slightly different from what we have discussed, but connected as well. I'm sure that most of the people in the audience also interested to talk a little bit about how AI also intersect in this space of social emotional learning. So next question is, as education system is increasingly relying on data infrastructures and AI supported assessments, what opportunities and risks do you see for SEL in this context emerging? I would like Bhavana and Dr. Tabasum to answer for this, as your work also are in the intersection of AI and SEL and also technology that you see in your work. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Anaga. Like it's very, in a way, fun to to work in SEL in today's context, because you are working with deeply like meaningful, in a way, deep conversation sometimes, and then suddenly you are brought back to, oh, what's happening in AI space, and how are you trying to like make the fit in this AI space? I guess like that is one intersection that I personally am also still figuring it out. And interestingly, I am a part of these AI conversations in SEL very recently, because I started working as a research fellow here in China. And interestingly, China has been focusing a lot on AI, left, right, and center. It's really trying to do a lot of research, and that's how I've started thinking, like, how does it look like, especially even in my context as well. So what I can say with my very little idea of my very little experience of trying to work around SEL and AI is that AI kind of offers some exciting possibilities. It can help us analyze large amount of qualitative data as well. Like, it helps to identify patterns across context. It supports reflection in ways, and potentially like reduce some administrative burdens associated with evaluation, I would say. Mostly, as we are talking about like the evaluation frameworks. However, the risks are like really important to consider as well, because many of the most important dimension of SEL, for example, trust, belonging, or compassion, dignity, or even emotional safety, are deeply relational and context dependent, where we need to be really careful, like, how are we going to use AI to ensure emotional safety? How does this conversation look like when you are taking AI as a companion? So that is one thing I'm really scared as well. But another is that AI can detect patterns in language or behavior, but it cannot fully understand the lived experiences of people. It cannot understand the history. It cannot understand the cultural meaning associated with it, or power dynamics behind them. So a lot of it is, even today, the AI, the language models are in itself being driven by the language of global north. So it becomes very tricky when we use it as a companion. So there's also a risk of that AI reinforces existing biases. And whenever I have used it, I have seen it firsthand as well, because it privileges those forms of like emotional expression that are already visible in data sets while overlooking others. So in diverse contexts, what appears as silence, what appears as hesitations, or even indirect communications may carry very different meaning in different cultures, and the algorithm might assume it completely different. Even within our context, I would say how we see shyness as a virtue is very different in the global south context. It turns as like someone to be less confident in someone is shy, but in our context, like, we people, like especially daughters, are asked to learn this skill to be shy. So how would we translate that into the context? So that is very important, and for me the goal is not to reject AI at this moment, but to remain very intentional about its role. And AI should support, I think, in human judgment rather than replacing it. So when we talk about evaluation, I would say evaluation approaches need to remain very relational. It has to be participatory and grounded in dialogue with the human. Those leave then and those with a human, like those whose lives are being really impacted by it. So the more technology we introduce, the more important human interpretation becomes. So if we kind of understand the this I think this nuance, it becomes complementary. But I think intention is very important. Having this skill of self-awareness and social emotional learning, all the competence of SEL, myself as a practitioner, comes in handy when I'm using AI. So that is how I am navigating this intersection these days.
Thank you, Bhavna. I think you spoke a lot along the lines that I was thinking. And with AI, it's like one of those things that's here, right? It's going to stay. We can't imagine going back to life where AI wasn't there. And it's taking over many aspects of our life, and we see that it's sort of influencing the kind of information we have and our exposure to information, especially lay users in this case much more. So with AI, we can definitely use AI for some things like in identifying or understanding some behaviors, looking at how peer interactions are evolving with time, and what with current generation, how things are different compared to how previous generations were. Sometimes we can use it to personalize learning experiences based on the needs of individual learners. And it can also be a way to be very quickly informed about global best practices in SEL. And what we see is, this emerging technologies, can help educators to respond more quickly to students who require additional support. It can provide support from a plethora of practices happening in different countries and cultural contexts. So we do see AI to be very useful, and it can be put to good use if we really know how to use it. One of the things that we have seen is at BRAC IED, what we've been doing is we've been exploring the integration of AI to support community-based paracounselors in providing mental health support, and how we can sort of help these paracounselors be more informed through AI. And what we've seen is in doing so that it's really important that you train AI with the context and culturally relevant knowledge and practices and information, so that the proposed solutions that are coming out of it are really applicable for the group that you're really looking into. It's similar with SEL integration. If you want to use AI, it's really important that we use AI that's trained to understand which context that SEL integration is going to happen in, who these people are, what their needs are, what their social context is, what their cultural context is. How do we ground it in that? So those things are really, really important if we want to use AI in a way that's really effective. Along with that, AI has the ability to really quickly and continuously reproduce existing biases that are out there related to cultures, language, and we can also see that if you search things, a lot of times the global North perspectives very heavily influence and overshadow global South values and practices, right? So this kind of things shows us that if you really rely on AI blindly, it's going to be really giving you things that you won't find to be useful, but may actually end up being more detrimental in some cases too, right? So, in that case, if AI is in reducing the human aspect of SEL, that's something we don't really want to do. That's really important, because that's the side of SEL that we want to develop, right? We want that person to succeed holistically, to be able to, compete, and to be able to be happy and thriving in this complex social world that they're being born into and growing up in. So along with that, coming from a global South country, what we see is in our context, there's the haves and the have-nots, right? And AI is actually increasing that divide in many ways, because the information that's being provided by AI, that is not only information, but in a lot of cases, it's misinformation. So with those misinformation, we see there's a further increase in inequality, we see a further increase in misuse. And in that way, in a lot of times, because SEL is a hype now, sometimes we see that SEL is being used as a decorative tool in many cases, and it's not really being effective. And AI makes it maybe easier to check that box, but it does not give us the results that we actually can see from SEL if it is used in the proper and correct manner.
Thank you. Thank you. Very new and interesting perspectives around like how AI and SEL can intersect, and what says is the intentionality of what we think, what we values in this process. I'm quickly moving to the next question, the final question. I know that this is slightly difficult. If you could change one assumption that currently shapes how SEL is understood or evaluated globally, what would it be? I know that it's very difficult to pick one, but according to you, what can be your top one assumption that you think it's important to change in this landscape? You can share that in a sentence or two, considering the time. Yeah. We can have this in the order of Sarah, Manjula, then Bhavana, and Tabs.
Okay, so I'll try my best to pick the one that really highlights the journey that I'm having here. So the assumption that I'm challenging is that the global South has somehow become a sweet site for applying all the research in SEL that's originated in the global North. And the alternative that I'm providing is that global South is perfectly capable of producing their innovative original research in SEL that in turn gives birth to the SEL programs and in tools that actually are beneficial for our audience, for our people. And what really happens when there are programs and tools designed meant for people in the global south, all done in good faith, but they somehow put us in a very narrow bucket, or and use language like maybe education in emergencies or conflict afflicted areas or trauma informed practices. That's the extent to which SEL gets applied from the global south, from the global north towards the global south. And what it does, it causes more harm than it could, because this is just a tiny population that we're talking about here. So global south is much more than its presence. We have decades and centuries of rich traditions, culture, and related to SEL, grounded in our communities and relationship that exist. But the theory, the container doesn't exist here. That's the entire problem. And yeah, so that's the one point that I want to put forward. And another thing is that while I am critiquing the approach that's prevalent, it does not discount the efforts that's been undertaken by our partners in the global north, among which I would really like to highlight the work that the Easy Lab has done in this regard. Not only have they designed this excellent taxonomy, now they're open to adapting it, co-creating it in a way that caters to global south as well. So what I'm trying to say is, maybe when I started off my journey in SEL, it may have become somewhat like of the part that we are not, our work is our concerns, our realities are not rightfully represented in the research there, right? But I've come to the point where I believe that it's not global north versus global south. It's about global north and global south sitting together, co-creating tools and resources, sharing knowledge that goes both ways. So that would be my takeaway from the entire panel. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. I think for me, I would kind of go back to one of my answers before. For SEL to be globally accepted and evaluation to be centrally accepted in our education systems, my answer for this would be the assumption of what purpose of education actually means. Because I think that's where we design or decide what's valuable, what we recognize as what education is for a young person, and then in turn reinforces what measurement would look like in education. So in our current context, we have narrowly defined the education or understood education as uh, serving this economic return and outcome for a young person to achieve that economic mobility and upward mobility, which in itself is great and I think serves a great purpose of education, but it cannot be the only purpose. What has happened in a lot of contexts is that it unfortunately has become the only purpose of education, where you spend all of your learning lives trying to prepare for that one exam or one credential certification, and build up on those academic credentials to land a job and have that economic stability. But what happens is then you question about what your meaning in life and purpose in life and how to navigate that real life. There's a enormous gap when it comes to a young person going through the education system and taking that first step into society and life. And a lot of them are not prepared for that. And we see some drastic implications and outcomes because of that gap. So my answer to this would be addressing and redefining that purpose, and in turn redefining what is valuable, and redefining what measurement should be, to make SEL not as an afterthought, but the centerpiece of that provides a meaning for education. Then we will see measurements and evaluations adapting to really captivate that mindset shift, the behavioral changes, of a learner. In Educate Lanka, we, in addition to providing this financial investment in and education of a young person, we take them into this project-based practices to practice their SEL competencies, to really harness the learning that they get in their community, their family, and really put them into practice. Because what happens mostly is that when they're preparing for employment and their transition into the society, a lot of them are asked about these emotional competencies. And what happens is we have lost a huge window of opportunity, their first 15 to 18 years of life, where we could have nurtured those skills and competencies. And all of a sudden now you're at 18, 20, 25, you've been asked to develop these competencies that should have been taught to you as a 3-year-old, 4-year-old, or a 13-year-old. So going back to really making SEL the centerpiece and the foundation of every person's learning, not as an afterthought or nice to have. And I live with this sort of if we continue to do what we do, what we will measure is what a young person would achieve. But what we will miss is who they are becoming. We won't be capturing that person who's stepping into the society to employment. We have all this data about what our graduates are, but we really don't know who they are in our measurements in the current form in our context. Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to be part of this.
Thank you very much. I would like to continue and try to answer this difficult question, but I would like to make it easy by borrowing what Dr. Srihari mentioned in his introduction speech and would re-emphasize on that. So if there's one assumption I would challenge is the same thing that he mentioned, is the belief that what matters most is what can be measured most easily. So some of the most transformative outcomes of SEL are not immediately visible. It takes a very long time, just as Manjula mentioned. So it takes a really, really long time. A student feeling safe enough to speak for the first time. A teacher learning to like respond with empathy rather than with punishment. A classroom like gradually become a space of trust and belonging. These changes are real, but they do not always fit neatly into these standardized indicators. So and it takes a very long time to actually see those impacts as well. So and with that quote unquote what Srihari mentioned in the beginning, I would also like to mention that I would also want to move to asking how do we to replace this, how do we measure SEL, to asking how do we meaningfully understand and learn from it. The shift is important because we have to move ahead from the extraction to from what we have extracted to towards reflection. I also think it's like we have tried a lot to show, like, to prove the impact of what SEL has, to really understand the experience, and from this universal metrics towards very contextual wisdom, because universal metrics might not fit in everywhere, but then this understanding, the relational aspect is very important if we want to really move ahead. So what I really understand with how much I have worked with SEL is that ultimately SEL is a lot more than individual skills. In competency, if you look at it, it looks like individual skills, but it is more than that. It is a lot about relationship, it is about culture, about communities, and the conditions that allow people to actually thrive in the situation that they're living in. So our evaluation approaches, in my sense, is it should be capable of seeing that complexity, rather than simply trying to simplifying it away. And I think, I would just also like to borrow what Shara mentioned, that it is very important that we find our own version, without saying who versus whom, because that in itself is also not what SEL is trying to do, if we are really practice SEL. So trying to find a intersection and not consider it as checking that one another tick box, in any context. So that is what I would really want to leave today's session with. Thank you very much for inviting. I really enjoyed listening to everyone.
So I think I feel Bhavna, Manjula, and Sarah has really highlighted very important points, some things we can really take away from here. For me, even before assessment, I think it is what are we assessing is really important. So from that angle, for me, it's really important, and I really would like to advocate for including the focus on cultural context, everyday interactions with people, and collective well-being in understanding SEL when we're looking at SEL for children as well as adults, alongside the popular SEL frameworks that are primarily used to understand the impact of SEL on individual development, right? So focus specifically on self-awareness and their individual relationship building skills and things like that. So we see, SEL is embedded in relationships that we have in the classroom practices we see in peer interactions, even in the play environments that we have, the games that the children play at, they grow up playing. However, in all of these cases, just because SEL is not explicitly mentioned as SEL, the implicit nature of it is often like overlooked and is not categorized as an SEL activity when we look in the global north frameworks, because they very categorically want SEL to be identified as an SEL activity. So I feel that I would like to see that the change to happen in this Western perspective, that would be really necessary for us to challenge this current global SEL practice and be able to put forth a strong and committed voice from the global South, like the South Asians that we are here today, and highlight that the cultural grounded SEL is really important. And those practices need to be voiced and need to be highlighted. And if we do that, in that way, we can share all our success stories, we can talk about these things. And the more we talk about it, the more noise we make. And it's really important that we do talk about these alternative ways of looking at SEL and success in SEL, and the alternative voice that we can raise. So that's something I would really like to see as a change. Thank you again, and I'm really happy to have participated in this conversation. Dream a dream, and thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Arun. I know that like I asked for one top thing, but I have a list of things, but I know that this is how it is, like purpose of education, moving beyond one size fits all, more than individual skills and how collective well-being is important and focus on culture. A lot of things emerged, which most of the things we know, but it's like reiterating what we are pushing forward. With that, we can take few questions. We are at 8:27, so we'll take the questions in the chat box now. I'll read the questions out, and we can take it from here. The social world of humans has always been increasingly influenced by digital technology. AI is more so transforming human tendencies in the social and emotional spaces, in many ways driving our evolutionary progress. In my opinion, the need for SEL will increase in the age of AI. The whole point of SEL is to keep social emotional spaces of human in a positive light. Then we as social emotional learning promoters are supposed to leverage AI to influence or practice SEL and not just complementary role it is assumed to be playing till now. Okay, I think, sorry, I think I missed the question. So it just jumbled. Sorry, I'll just read it again. I'll just summarize the question. As SEL promoters, are we supposed to leverage AI to influence or practice SEL in whatever capacity? Isn't this very stupidly funny? So this is the question. I guess this is understood. Do you want to take this, Bhavna?
Mm, yeah, sure. In a way, it sounds definitely funny, but I think it's one of the paradoxes of our time. So definitely is a paradox that we're living in. And like what you're pointing is a tension that even I go through, and along with me, a lot of educators, even psychologists these days. I guess like because I think that when we talk about students, not just like teenagers, even like adults are more interested and feel safe talking to AI than talking to a psychologist, human psychologist. So that is one of the one of the tension that we're living in. But also I think Dr. Tabusum also mentioned about this, like how we're using technology becomes very important, especially in how it like reshapes human relationships, our attentions, and also the social behavior. So on the surface it definitely sounds ironic, but if we look beyond that, I think if we focus more on preserving memory, if we focus on trying to build this model with the by giving the contextual background, then I think we in some ways can get a lot of leverage out of it. In a lot of ways, I think like we use the schools to teach collaboration in societies, right? And we kind of like reward the competition. And for me, I also sometimes like come to this grapple through this tension that how do we actually do that? We make them compete with each other, we also and then reward them, which in itself is something very different than how we as a society thrive. So that is a tension in itself. But in today's context, if we are looking AI as one of the important part, AI is definitely better at information. We can use it for that. It's better at automating tasks. Maybe as a teacher, I can use to automate some of the tasks, but I would not use it to build trust with my students. So I can use it to recognize patterns, but how am I going to use the recognition of those patterns to help build the relationship with my students is something that I had to figure out myself. So I guess it's funny, it's ironic, but maybe with a warning, with a very strong warning, maybe I would use it as a very intentional practice to try to learn, adjust, and thrive in this society, which is not going to go backwards, in a sense that with AI it's always going to move forward. And as educators, as parents also, I think it's very important that we try to learn to juggle between these tensions, which is very one of the very important components of social emotional learning as well, to how to like live in this complex world. So I would look at it that way.
Thank you, Bhavna. We can take one more question. Sorry if I'm missing any question. So the next question is how we can help create more spaces to share these kind of reflection when there seems to be a rush and high pressure to measure SEL in education system. I see Manjula have responded saying that there is space you can discuss this. So would like you to share a little bit to that question and then we can close.
Sorry, I was replying to another question. This
Okay.
is about Karanga, right?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. No, I would love. So Karanga is something that a collective community effort that came out of the Salzburg Global Seminar back in 2018. When we first kind of grappled with this question about SEL, that was the first time I was introduced to this terminology about SEL, and really kind of recognize a lot of the things that we've been doing through our organization fit into this framework. Uh, what transpired from there was this specific need of the missing platform or an ecosystem to share and understand from each other, both across global north and south, but also within global south itself and global north itself, and to bring a global community together to share their practices in their own context, and really that would lead into collaborations and partnerships and collective learning engagement. So we have monthly meetings that we do as part of our community membership, and there are many events that get shared within the membership. So it's free to join. Just please reach out to us, and we would love to have you all join our community.
Yeah, thank you. I'm realizing that we have passed our time that we have fixed for. So I'm just quickly inviting my colleague Ketaki for a quick synthesis and reflection sharing of the session. Ketaki, over to you. Just one more information. I know that there are a few questions that we missed in the chat box. So we'll be sharing a question answer link where you can add your question, and we ensure that we'll answer those questions when we are replying you over a mail. So I'm gonna share that link. Please add your questions, whatever it is. We'll be sharing the answers from the panels.
Um, okay, yeah, sorry, I know we've run out of time, so sorry about that. But just to summarize, I think we had a really, really interesting and insightful conversation on SEL. I think one of the really important things that came up as our panelists reminded us that SEL is not in any way new to the Global South, to our countries, to our context. We have had a rich and long tradition of living SEL through our families, through our communities, through existing relationships, and just that it has not been named as SEL for very long. And I think what is at stake for us right now is, of course, not whether or not we can measure SEL, but what are we measuring? What are we making visible through these measurements? And what kind of realities are we trying to capture through these evaluations, right? And because this has then stakes for what matters in education, also larger practical questions of what gets funded in education. And I think, as we're saying, all our panelists have already initiated some of this work, whether it is in the form of trying to capture different forms of relational ways of being, or community-based, grounded, cultural ways of understanding SEL, and or developing grounded global South theory around this. So a lot of this work is happening, and it's very exciting to see. Um, and we also talked about collaborating, right? This is not a global South versus global North conversation, but this is about kind of positioning global South also as a legitimate space of knowledge and voices and theory. And I think we can all look forward to kind of continuing to see some of this collaborative and culturally and historically grounded knowledge on SEL. And I think some of these conversations can continue. There's a lot of questions on chat, and maybe you can reach out to both the Dream a Dream team and the panelists over email, and we can continue these conversations. I know we're past time, so I'll stop here. I just really, really want to thank all of our panelists for such a rich and fruitful conversation. Thank you to Anaga for moderating. Thanks, Srihari, also for opening and setting the context. Thank you to everyone in the Dream a Dream team who helped put this together, for Ravi, Satvik, note takers. Thank you very much to our ISL interpreters, right? And of course, thank you to all of you who joined, listened, and engaged, and will help us take this conversation on SEL forward. Thanks a lot. Okay.
Thank you, Anaga. Thank you,
Yeah.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you again. Thank
you.
you.
Oh. We are still staying for the picture, right?
Yes, yeah.
If the panelists could please stay back, and if anyone else wants to stay and turn their videos on, we would like to take a group picture.
Devi, can you Let us know like when the picture is clicked.